the outskirts of Blackwood, where the roads became little more than dirt paths swallowed by gnarled trees, an eerie phenomenon had taken root. At night, the abandoned houses that dotted the landscape took on a life of their own. People spoke in hushed tones of the glowing eyes that appeared in the windows of these forgotten homes, twin orbs of sickly yellow light that pulsed like dying embers. The first sightings were dismissed as tricks of the moonlight or the product of overactive imaginations. But as the stories grew, so did the fear. Travelers passing through the area would report an overwhelming sense of being watched. Some described the feeling of invisible hands skimming their skin, a pressure at their backs urging them to move faster. The locals, long accustomed to the strange and unexplained, knew better than to linger near these forsaken places after sundown. Old Man Garrett, the town's last remaining historian, often muttered about the history of those homes. They had once been lived in decades ago, before the disappearances started. One by one, the families had vanished, their houses left to decay under the weight of time. No bodies were ever found, no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty houses with open doors and cracked windows, staring out like empty eye sockets. Teenagers, drunk on bravado and dares, sometimes ventured too close. They would return pale-faced and shaking, whispering about the shadows moving behind the glass. Some claimed they had seen the eyes up close, mere inches from their own faces, separated only by the brittle pane of a rotting window. Others said they heard something, a whisper, a rustling breath, a voice calling their name. Then came the disappearances. First, it was a vagrant, a nameless man who had been sleeping in one of the abandoned houses. The sheriff found his bedroll still warm, his few belongings undisturbed, but the man himself was gone. No footprints leading away, no sign of a struggle, just silence. Next was a girl from the nearby town of Ashbury. She had been walking home alone when she made the mistake of glancing toward one of the vacant houses. Her last message to her friend was a short text. "There's someone in the window." She was never seen again. The town became gripped with fear. Doors were locked before sundown, and curtains drawn tight. Even those who claimed not to believe in ghosts refused to look at the windows of those houses. It was an unspoken rule: do not meet their gaze. But curiosity is a cruel master, and some temptations are too great to resist. And so, the disappearances continued. Fear is a strange thing. It keeps most people away from danger, but for some, it calls like an irresistible whisper in the dark. Despite the growing number of disappearances, despite the whispered warnings from the town's oldest residents, there were always those who wanted to test their luck. They wanted proof. They wanted to see the eyes for themselves. And so, they went looking. The latest group to try their luck was a trio of reckless thrill seekers: Mark, Danny, and Claire. They weren't from Blackwood, just college kids from a neighboring town who had heard the stories and thought they were nothing more than backwoods superstition. They wanted a good scare, something to brag about later. They arrived just past midnight, when the town was asleep, and the abandoned houses stood like silent sentinels against the trees. Their chosen target was the old Grayson house, a decrepit two-story home that had been empty for decades. It was one of the most infamous locations. Several people who had vanished were last seen near it, armed with nothing but their phones and a cheap flashlight. They approached the house. The porch sagged under their weight, the wood brittle and soft with rot. The front door was unlocked, of course. None of these houses were ever locked. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Wallpaper curled at the edges, and dust coated every surface. A broken staircase led to the second floor, where the windows stared out into the darkness like vacant eyes. Mark and Danny laughed nervously, pushing each other forward, while Claire lagged behind, suddenly uneasy. The walls felt too close. The silence was too deep. Then, as Mark swept his flashlight across the room, the beam landed on something that shouldn't have been there. A pair of glowing eyes. Not human, not quite animal. They floated in the darkness of the second floor window, staring down at them with a quiet, pulsing light. Danny cursed under his breath. Mark chuckled, though his voice was tight. Claire, however, took a step back, and then the eyes blinked. Not in a normal way. Not with lids closing over them, but with a flicker, as if they had vanished for a fraction of a second, and then reappeared, slightly closer. That was enough for Claire. She turned and ran. Danny hesitated for a moment before following. Mark, either braver or more foolish, stayed behind, staring up at the window. The eyes did not move. They did not shift. They only watched. Then, slowly, Mark raised his phone and took a picture. The instant the flash went off, the house groaned, a deep, shuddering sound that came from the walls themselves. The floor trembled beneath him. The eyes in the window pulsed brightly, their glow intensifying. And then, Mark screamed. It wasn't a sound of pain. It was a sound of terror, raw and primal. His body convulsed, his phone slipping from his fingers. And then he was gone. Not yanked away, not pulled through a door. Just gone. Danny and Claire had barely made it to the street when they realized he wasn't behind them. They turned back, their breath coming in frantic gasps. The house was silent again. The window was empty. Mark was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, the police found Danny and Claire huddled together in the sheriff's office, pale and shaking. Their story was incomprehensible. A house that swallowed people whole. Floating eyes. It sounded like drunken nonsense. But Mark was truly gone. His car was still parked by the road. His footprints led into the house but never came out. His phone was found lying in the dust near the doorway. And the last picture taken, a grainy image of the second floor window. No glowing eyes, no figure, just the faintest outline of a face staring back. A face that looked an awful lot like Mark. Mark wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. Over the next few weeks, more people disappeared. A young couple parked near the houses, hoping to catch a glimpse of the infamous glowing eyes. Their car was found with the doors wide open, headlights still on. No sign of them. A journalist from a small paranormal magazine came to investigate. He checked into a motel, asked the locals questions, and ventured into one of the abandoned homes. The next morning, the motel room was empty. His belongings were still there. His car keys rested on the nightstand. But he was gone. The pattern became clear. Anyone who looked for too long, anyone who focused on the eyes, was taken. Blackwood became a ghost town after sunset. Residents refused to speak of the disappearances, and those who had lost loved ones never shared their grief openly. The pain was unspoken but ever present. The police had no answers. No bodies were ever found. No signs of struggle. No trace of the missing remained. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. And yet, the eyes remained. Night after night, they appeared in the windows of the abandoned homes, waiting, watching. The town learned to ignore them, to never look too long, to never acknowledge them at all. But some were not so lucky. Ethan arrived arrived in Blackwood as an outsider, a skeptic, a documentary filmmaker chasing urban legends. He had read about the disappearances online, pieced together the stories, and convinced himself that it was nothing more than small-town hysteria. With his camera and microphone, he planned to prove the myths wrong. He set up outside one of the most infamous houses, the old Grayson house, where Mark had vanished. He recorded interviews with frightened townsfolk, capturing their unease on film. He dismissed their warnings, their whispered pleas for him to leave. Then, as night fell, he turned his lens toward the house. Through the viewfinder, he saw them, two glowing eyes in the upstairs window flickering softly. He grinned. Finally, proof. He zoomed in, focusing on them, trying to see past the glow. His heartbeat quickened. There was something behind them, a shape, a figure. He adjusted the focus. The shape became clearer. His own reflection stared back at him. Confusion gripped him. He wasn't standing in front of a mirror. He was outside. A wave of dizziness hit him, a cold, suffocating sensation. His limbs felt heavy. His breath caught in his throat. Then, suddenly he wasn't outside anymore. He was in the house, standing at the window, looking out. He couldn't move, couldn't scream, could only watch as his own body, his former body, collapsed outside, camera slipping from lifeless fingers. He wasn't Ethan anymore. He was something else. And outside, down on the street, he saw movement, a group of teenagers approaching. They were looking at the window, looking at him. Their curiosity would be their undoing, because now he was the eyes in the window, and soon they would be too.
Darkness pressed in from all sides, thick and suffocating. Ethan could still feel the cold weight of it against his skin, could still sense the moment when his body had crumpled outside, lifeless, and he had become something else. Something trapped. His mind raced, clawing for logic, for understanding, but the truth was as inescapable as the window pane before him. He was no longer outside, no longer in control of his body, no longer human. Instead, he was inside the house, inside the walls, inside the glass, a prisoner in the window. From this cursed vantage point, he could see everything with terrible clarity. The town of Blackwood stretched before him, the empty street bathed in the cold glow of the streetlights. He saw his own body, motionless on the ground outside, twisted in a position that made his stomach churn. A grotesque husk, discarded like a broken puppet. Yet, somehow, he was still conscious, still thinking, still watching. And he was not alone. A whisper slithered through the air, barely a sound, more of a sensation, a brushing of something unseen against his thoughts. Another one joins us. The words weren't spoken aloud, but they echoed inside his skull. Ethan turned, or at least, he felt himself turning, though his body did not move. The window was no longer just a pane of glass. It was a mirror, stretching deep into an endless void. And in its depths, he saw them. Faces, so many faces, men, women, children, eyes hollow with fear, lips frozen mid-scream. Trapped behind the glass, their images flickering in and out of existence, as if reality itself struggled to hold on to them. Mark was there. His face was pale, his mouth stretched in a silent plea, fingers pressed against the surface as if he were trying to push through. And there were others, dozens, hundreds. A sea of lost souls, floating in the abyss of the glass, whispering, murmuring, waiting. Ethan's mind recoiled, but there was nowhere to go, no escape. He tried to move, nothing. He tried to scream, silence. All he could do was look, and outside on the street, a new set of footsteps crunched against the gravel. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, silhouetted against the pale light. Teenagers, young, stupid, the kind that chased thrills without understanding the price. Ethan wanted to warn them, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but stare, but he could do nothing. The figures moved closer, their whispers carrying through the dead air. One of them laughed, a nervous, forced sound, the bravado of someone who didn't yet know they had already made a fatal mistake. Then one of them stopped. A boy, no older than 17, lifted his head toward the window, toward Ethan. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Ethan felt it happening. A shift, a pull. The window was no longer just a surface, it was a door, a gaping maw, and the boy had just stepped too close. His expression changed from curiosity to horror. His pupils dilated, his breath hitched in his throat. He tried to look away, but it was already too late. The glass trembled. A low, droning hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls of the house. The other two teenagers noticed. One of them called the boy's name, James, maybe, or Jacob, but it didn't matter, because James, or Jacob, was already being pulled in. His body spasmed, his skin became translucent, and then he was gone. The other two screamed. Ethan saw it all, watched as the boy's form bled into the glass, his features stretching, twisting, contorting, before finally he was here, inside, with them, the newest prisoner of the window. His mouth opened in a soundless scream, his hands clawing at the glass, just as Ethan had done moments ago, just as Mark had done, just as all of them had done. Outside, the remaining two teenagers ran, and Ethan knew they would spread the story. The legend would grow, more would come, more would look, more would join them. Time no longer had meaning. Ethan wasn't sure how long he remained trapped in the glass, staring out into the night. Days passed, weeks, months, perhaps years. He didn't know. The town carried on, oblivious. People still avoided the houses, but whispers of the disappearances never faded. A cycle of fear and curiosity. And Ethan? He changed. At first, he had fought, had raged, had screamed, had tried desperately to break free. But the glass does not let go. It wears you down. It makes you forget. Little by little, his memories faded. His past life, his home, his family, his name, became distant echoes, washed away like footprints in the tide. The house became his world, the glass became his prison, and the hunger, the need, became unbearable. Because that was the final cruelty of the window. It didn't just trap you, it turned you, twisted you into something else, a watcher, a hunter. And soon, Ethan realized the truth. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was part of the trap. The next time someone walked too close, too curious for their own good, Ethan felt the pull. The window wanted them, and deep inside, buried beneath the remnants of his fading humanity, he wanted them too, because the only way to escape was to replace yourself, to pass the curse to another. And so, when the next foolish soul met his gaze, Ethan did not fight it. He let it happen. The glass trembled, the boy screamed, and Ethan felt himself slipping free. He barely had time to comprehend what was happening before he was outside again. His body, warm, alive, real. He gasped, the sensation of lungs filling with air overwhelming him. He stumbled backward, heart hammering, hands trembling. He was free. Then he looked down, at the new reflection in the window, a new prisoner pounding on the glass, mouthing silent screams. The curse remained. It only changed hands. And in the distance, more footsteps approached. Another soul drawn to the legend. Another foolish, curious wanderer. Ethan turned. His lips curled into a smile. And this time he did not look away, because now it was his turn to watch.